Vulture, and welcome to the Distil-Nation NZ podcast. Now, if that sounds a little different, that's because it's me, Cameron, doing the intro today. Tom is off. I am flying solo, but I am joined by a man who I think has one of, if not the coolest job titles in New Zealand. I'm joined by Jim Geddes, who is curator of the Hokonui Moonshine Museum. Welcome, Jim.
Thank you very much.
Tell me, I think it will be a surprise to most people that New Zealand even has a moonshine museum. When and how did it all come about?
It was a community initiative a number of years ago that I was brought on board to assist them with, because our area of Southland, and actually several areas of Southland, had, I guess, a heritage of localised prohibition, which helped invigorate an illicit distillation history, which we had anyway, but it was a craft that was sort of hidden from view for many years, and we can date illicit distillation in the south back to the 1830s and to the whaling stations of the south coast. But the Hokonui tradition proper began, I guess, with the arrival of Highland Scots into this area of Southland in the 1870s. I guess as far as Hokonui is concerned, we need to acknowledge the matriarch of that tradition, a remarkable woman called Mary McRae, who arrived here in 1872. She was a healer and a midwife, but she was also a home distiller. And when she arrived in Port Chalmers with her 7 grown children, she'd sadly lost her husband in Scotland, with her 7 grown children and a box marked household goods. And in that box was a small whiskey still. She had made spirit illicitly in the Highlands of Scotland, and when she emigrated here, she continued with that tradition. It was part of her culture. It was something that was produced for family celebrations and medicinal purposes, and she continued that tradition here within the embrace of a wider whānau, other immigrants from the same part of Scotland, other clans, and it was a celebration of their culture, and they pretty much minded their own business. Hokonui is our primary geographic form. It's the Hokonui Hills are the backdrop for Gore District, and even though we are called Gore District, in the broader sense, we are Hokonui. Hokonui has become a generic term for illicit distillation in Southland, and to that end, it's a term that denotes the ancient and noble, the acclimatisation of the ancient and noble Highland art of tax evasion. So that is largely what our museum is about. We embrace the Hokonui tradition or the spirit-making tradition of the Highland Scottish settlers, but the Hokonui tradition has come out of, I guess, a culture that was disinclined to entertain Crown interventions like excise tax. On moral and political grounds, certainly in Scotland. I think when Mary McRae arrived here in the 1870s, she didn't actually have any issue with the New Zealand Crown as such, but if you're on a bush farm in the middle of Southland in 1872, where's the tax office? So they continued that strong tradition, but it was very carefully managed. When the old McRaes produced their spirit, and they produced a very fine spirit, they were very careful that they didn't put it into a home where it would do any harm. There's a lovely quote from the Hokonui schoolmaster of the 1880s and talking about the McRaes, and it's the big family of McRaes. There was various connections who arrived of the same clan to the same part. He said that they were some of the most sterling people he had ever met in this world, a kind, generous, sociable people, anxious for the education of their children, but with a strong leaning towards their national beverage.
Yeah, it's so fascinating because, as as you have said, that these are a lot of the same attitudes towards paying tax, but also making spirit that have come over from Scotland, where over there it was very much you've got a crop, and distilling that grain is actually just the next natural phase in the life cycle of the farm and of that grain, what you would then use to trade with other people. So it is unsurprising, but I think what in my own studies, when I was writing about the early Dunedin settlement for my history degree, there was a much the kinds of people who were settling in Dunedin were far more likely to be your uptight Presbyterian, nose in the air kind of Scots, as opposed to your Highland, most likely, and I'm going out on a limb here, Gaelic speaking Highland Scots. Is
Catholic
that
Scott. Yep.
Catholic Scots? Is that the difference? Is the demarcation along religious grounds?
That was to a degree here, and having been born and bred here, and my ancestors are from here, there's that dichotomy between the Highland Catholic Scottish tradition and the Lowland Presbyterian Scottish tradition, and both came here. It's fair to say that it was the sudden development of the settlements in Southland, because Gore and surrounding areas were settled quite late. They were developed quite late. When Southland split from Otago in 1861, there was a new provincial council that suddenly had all this money to spend on these places. And that was on bridges and railways and surveying towns. And Gore is a really good example of a town that was surveyed very quickly in 1862 to get money from the government to bridge the Matilda River and put in a railway and survey a town. And all this work had to happen. And it needed men, lots and lots of men, itinerant labourers, to come into a place and physically build a new town and a new infrastructure. So we had that situation here in the 1880s and 1890s, where Gore was a really drunken frontier town. It was hard men who worked hard, and when they hit town hard. And we had a number of licensed establishments here with very lax licensing laws. And it was diabolical. And probably when you've got particularly the Free Church of Scotland settlers, the Presbyterian settlers who were coming in here to build churches and schools and businesses and develop a good, hard-working, God-fearing community, they had this issue of this itinerant population that were causing enormous problems. So they had to do something about it. And collectively, through the 1890s in particular, they agitated to the point where they instigated what's regarded as the blackest day in Gore's history, and that was the 30th of June, 1902. A referendum was held, prohibition was passed, and the 15 hotels in the licensing district had exactly 6 months to cease trading. So from the 1st of July, 1903, Gore went dry, and it stayed dry for 51 years. Now, in the background, you had Clan McRae, who, as I mentioned before, would never put their product into a home where it would do any harm. They kept themselves to themselves. They were remarkable people. Because of localised prohibition, suddenly there was a client base for what members of the wider Clan McRae were producing. And they filled a gap. And then later generations filled a very significant gap, because over 51 years of prohibition, there was a client base. But because they'd continued with that tradition of not paying excise tax, it drew attention from customs and, of course, police, to the point where the New Zealand Customs Service set up an office in Southland with the primary objective of shutting down illicit distillation activity. And it was a cat and mouse game between distillers, illicit distillers, moonshiners, and police and customs. And there was a remarkable, 50-year tradition of illicit spirit making, and these people being pursued by police and customs.
I've read about some of these stories, and I'm hoping you can elaborate on some more for me. There's the New Zealand whiskey book, and there's another book called Grog's Own Country, and those were the two that we really looked at for some previous episodes of the podcast. Now, one of them was, and maybe you can answer this for me. I don't know how the coppers got the horses, but they managed to get some horses that belonged to the McRaes, kind of saddled them up, slapped them on the rump, and then used the horses as like a primitive form of GPS. Kind of the horses knew where to go. They followed the horses as they walked up onto the stills and got them. But what that book didn't answer for me was the McRaes probably wouldn't have just lent their pack horses off to somebody. So how would they go about getting those horses so that they could then, play these tricks and these cat and mouse games?
That was one particular instance, and it was a grandnephew of Mary, Billy McRae, who was selling an enormous amount of spirit in Invercargill in the 1930s. In 1934, police and customs officers decided to raid his farm, which was in the Dunsdale area adjacent to a bush reserve. Now, they searched every inch of the property. They couldn't find anything. But they were sufficiently suspicious to enact a second raid 2 weeks later. And again, they couldn't find any equipment, no ingredients, no spirit on the property. But one of the constables noticed Billy's horse lolling about the sheep yards untethered. And it had these sort of curious looking brackets on the, or hooks on the saddle for clearly carrying heavy loads off something somewhere. And a constable climbed into the saddle and gave the horse a kick and let the reins go. And this horse just did what it normally did, was wander up the boundary, through a hole in the fence, into this bit of reserve bushland across the fence from Billy's farm, down a bush track, and led him directly to Billy's still. Because this horse had been carrying all the ingredients, obviously. Yeah. The still site was by a creek. It had 130 gallons of wash, was on site, but it wasn't on Billy's property. So they couldn't prosecute him. They went to great lengths to try and connect him to the property, even to going to the lengths of instigating the first instance of aerial surveillance in New Zealand, flying a de Havilland Foxmoth aircraft over Billy's property and the bush property, with a senior customs official hanging out the window with a box brownie camera taking photographs to present in court to determine that Billy was the only person who had access to this bit of land. So it had to be his still. There wasn't sufficient evidence to connect him to the still. He was fined £30 for stealing a railway's tarpaulin, which was used on site. But they had to be very careful about getting sufficient evidence to either catch people in the act or to have, something very, very concrete to connect that person to that piece of equipment. Billy got away with that. But there's been other instances where there's been various tall stories. Some of them we've decided were fantasy. Others are growing day by day as we receive oral histories from various family sources. But there's certainly one horse that was involved in the demise of Billy McRae's enterprise.
And I guess for a moment, jumping through to the present day, is this part of your role is building out, fleshing out, developing these histories, finding, where people uncover something at home, they're then coming to you to say, hey, is this something? Or, hey, here's a piece of family lore that's been passed through. This is part of your job today.
Well, it has been. When we first scoped the museum project, that was way back in 1998, 99. We did a lot of work. We worked with descendants of various people who were involved. The great-grandson of Mary, Bill Stewart, who is still living, he's 95, sharp as a tack, is our museum patron, and he was instrumental in gathering up a lot of material. Others who weren't quite connected to the McRaes, who had operations on family farms, and the farms are still in the family, have been very helpful. There's one quite important still site recreation in the museum, which relates to a cowshed just south of here. And the cowshed is actually the original one that the Kirk brothers and a chap called Jim Botting were caught red-handed on the 25th of March 1942, and it is the original cowshed. We dismantled it and rebuilt it in the museum. And we were lucky because these chaps were caught red-handed. Because they were caught in 1942, in 1998, there were still people around who remember them being caught and remember them being prosecuted. They remember that they were informed upon by somebody sort of in the district who was going to receive part of their significant fines by way of reward for the information provided. And when they were taken to court in 1942 and they were prosecuted and fined, collectively fined £800, which was an enormous amount of money in those days, we discovered that they opted for jail in lieu of paying fines, which they could do. They refused to pay the fines. They could have paid them, but on principle, they weren't going to. And we were able to collect recollections from people who remember the discussions they had with those chaps when they got out of jail. They were treated like royalty in Invercargill prison at the time of their life down there.
I imagine they would have had quite a few customers, some loyal customers, perhaps, who were in there with them.
Yes, yeah. So there would have been a lot more. It's just that the evidence had to be so strong. In fact, the people I spoke about were the only ones ever caught in the act. Of the 31 prosecutions for breach of the Distil-Nation Act, and that's roughly between 1928 and 1957, there was only one instance of people being caught in the act. Everything else was sort of people either admitting that it was their equipment and it was their property, or else just being unlucky. But they often, in those instances, escaped fairly significant fines because the evidence was just a bit shaky. But they were doing something that was not quite right.
Well, I mean, and this probably, and I hope you can elaborate on this, speaks to some of the public attitudes that the McRaes may have been the most famous moonshiners. They definitely weren't the only moonshiners out there, but there's this case and that they reference in the New Zealand whiskey book, and this guy, this Crown prosecutor, he thinks he's got them dead to rights, and he lays out his case, and he's like, I've got him. And the jury come back with a verdict of not guilty. And I forget this prosecutor's name, but he goes back to his dad, who was also a former Crown prosecutor, and says, don't believe it. I had him. I had all the evidence. My argument was solid. It was great. And the dad looks at his son and says, well, what did you expect with a Heelanman for a foreman?
Yes, I know the case. Yeah.
Right. So does that speak to the community attitude of it's a victimless crime? Why? Surely there's got to be more important things for you coppers to be chasing. Like, yeah,
I believe that's the case.
Yeah. So, like, societal attitudes. How do we reconcile the fact that there was such a strong public outcry for the district going dry versus we're not really all that interested in prosecuting these moonshiners? It just seems like there's such a disparate attitudes.
Yeah, it's interesting looking at the enormous respect that the McRaes had right across the district, and there's generations of them. And there was various strands of McRaes as well. Interestingly, the three big families of McRae that came from the same part of Scotland, they weren't related over there, but they intermarried once they got here. And it was interesting that Mary came from a tradition where it was women that did the home distilling. And of course, her generation, it was really top quality spirit that was produced. They did it, as they were supposed to. When it got to the 1930s and 1940s here in this area in particular, everybody was having a go at it. And the quality just dissipated. I think, to be fair, there was a public health issue in some regards, because what we discovered was we had a brewery in Gore, and it was doing quite good business leading up to the passing of localised prohibition, and then it really took off. It did a roaring trade right through those 51 years of Gore being dry. They could not sell beer from the premises. It had to be ordered in quantities of not less than 2 gallons and shipped outside the county. But what it could quite legally sell out the back door was bags of malt, brewer's yeast, bulk sugar, all that stuff you need to put through a still. So everybody was really having a go at it. And there's one instance with a case where some bottles were produced, and a chap who assisted them in securing the wash, he was a local stock and station agent who sort of picked it up from the brewery and dropped it off at the farm and helped them make a wash, and then was given some of the spirit in return. And there's a lovely quote. He sort of said, "I had a drink and I thought there's something bloody funny about that whiskey." He said, "Later they told me they'd fished a dead rat out of a bucket of that lot, but they bottled it up anyway." I think the old McRae's, Mary's generation, they had that sense of taste and sense of smell and know what is good and what's bad, because there's some really bad stuff comes out of a distillation process. And if you're just having a go and you're producing bulk spirit and getting rid of it as quickly as possible, then there is a tax evasion issue, but there's often a health and safety issue as well.
Yes. Yeah, we've certainly, and I think for this time period that you're talking about, that's more when it becomes a public health kind of issue, when people who haven't grown up in the traditions, maybe the motivation's off. But let's bring it back to the spirit. You've been very, very kind enough. I'm going to hold this bottle up now. So tell me about the label. What's going on here?
Right, we did a bit of research about that label, because it's always sort of known, the old Hokonui label, the skull and crossbones one, has sort of been floating about. And we did a bit of research, and there's various versions, but the one that's come up through affidavits from court, from trials, is that was a label that was applied by an entrepreneur called Gerald Enright. He was known as the Major, and he operated probably closer to Invercargill than to Gore, than to Hokonui. He was prosecuted in 1950 and then again in 1957. Had an enormous supply chain. He was servicing clients up and down State Highway 1, in Clutha and North Otago, and even as far as Ashburton. And he would label his spirit. Of course, the McRae's never labelled theirs. A lot of people didn't. You couldn't, you didn't want to implicate a printer or anybody like that. But he was quite an entrepreneurial character. He was a lovely guy by all accounts. So he developed that label, and we found a document that would relating to a case where a dental technician at Invercargill Hospital had admitted to making a printing block on night shift in 1938. And we think that he had an ink roller, and he used to do them and make them for Enright. So that's sort of it's a label that, for obvious reasons, was never registered or branded. Enright was caught in 1950. He was fined £415. In almost every instance, the still was confiscated and destroyed. In this instance, he had all these this amazing brass boiler and all these sort of, incredible fittings. It was quite a handsome piece of work. And instead of destroying it, Customs, to recover some costs of prosecuting him, sold the components off at Todd's Auctions in Invercargill. And Enright just had some mates bidding for it, and he got it back again. He was caught again in 1950, and this time he was jailed. Now, apart from the fact he was still making what he called Hokonui, he was using the same equipment seized 7 years earlier. But he was probably, Hokonui was always a generic term, and it was always in honour of the McRaes, but he was probably the one who first branded it. And then we discovered when we did the museum, and then we wanted to sort of do our own product, that actually it hadn't ever been registered, so we better register it, and we did. So it's in public ownership, it's owned by a trust, and we apply it to that product. And of course, the original that I showed you is a clear spirit. It's a barley-based spirit, and that was Hokonui. People, Hokonui was, in the old days, was a whiskey, but certainly latterly it was never a whiskey. It was always a grain spirit. Came out of the still, it was finished to an acceptable, alcohol by volume percentage, and then got rid of as quickly as possible, and cheaply, because there was no excise component. So it was clear as a bell. We discovered various people had recipes for colouring the spirit to make it look like and taste like a whiskey for a certain client base, and we think Enright certainly did that. But rather than through a barrel aging process, which proper whiskey goes through, it was generally through a steeping and colouring process, and we've attended to that as well. And I think I sent you another bottle of what we call Manuka smoked, and that's following a process whereby Manuka from the Hokonui Hills has been cut up and toasted in a baker's oven with charcoal, put in a vat, and we've put our Hokonui original on top of it. And you go through this sort of arduous filtering process to get the steeping happening and get the colouring and the flavouring happening. So it's still not whiskey. Looks like it, tastes like it, but it's grain spirit.
All right. Well, I'm going to pour myself a little bit of that original, but I guess would the McRaes have been actually putting stuff in a barrel to make whiskey, or was their focus really just a grain spirit that they can then sell on?
We know that the old McRaes made whiskey and they had access to barrels. We know that because there was an instance where, in fact, there were 3 visitations to the McRae cottage in the 1890s, and turn of the century. Excuse me. One instance, there was a barrel in the house and Mary sat on it with her voluminous skirts covering the barrel, and she did not get up to greet visiting police. And that's why. We know on another occasion that there were demijohns of freshly barreled spirit that had reached its time, was getting ready for distribution, and police appeared. And these demijohns Mary was put to bed, and demijohns of whiskey were put around her under the quilts. And they knew that the police would not be so impolite as to look underneath the covers, so she greeted them from her bedroom. Another instance where police, under cover of night, crept up on the McRae cottage, and that was quite a task in its own right, to not only spy barrels but also to overhear conversations and gather incriminating evidence, only to discover after all that effort that the McRaes only spoke Gaelic at home. We know that they made a proper whiskey. In 1925, the Great South Seas exhibition in Dunedin, some bottles of McRae Hokonui whiskey that had been barrel aged, was presented at a trade stand there, because of the big, Scotch distilleries had trade stands there. It was a huge exhibition. And
at that point, you had the New Zealand distillery based in Dunedin, and you had the Crown distillery based out of Auckland, right?
Probably, yeah, that would be it. 1925. That's it.
Yeah.
So Murdoch McRae, who became a master distiller, he was taught by Mary, obviously, presented some whiskey there, and it was acknowledged as being as good as Scotland's best. That's why it's got that lovely catchphrase on the label that says "Passed all tests except the police." Interestingly, we discovered through Bill's reminiscences of Bill Stewart, the great grandson of Mary, talking about the family dynamic and the passing down of recipes and processes through the family. He said that Mary, once she got here and realised it was quite a different environment as far as the drinking culture was concerned, that she stopped teaching the women in the family to distill and she started teaching her sons. And that's probably where Murdoch and Christopher and John and various others all became important distillers and very talented distillers in their own right. Women in the family were encouraged to marry plumbers and tinsmiths, which they did. Was
All right,
really
yeah.
they needed to the little pot still that Mary bought with her on the Hydaspes in 1872. It probably was far too small because it was just for home distilling essentially. If they were going to do anything on a commercial basis, they needed bigger equipment, and they needed people who were skilled in making that equipment, but also people who could keep their mouths shut.
Yes, and you're not going to inform on family, are you?
Exactly.
So the still that you have in the museum, is that making to a particular recipe? How have you landed on the recipe here for what's in the glass?
That is a recipe that was developed by a distiller, Steve Nelly from Invercargill, and it's utilising local grain, laureate barley, which has been shipped to Gladfields and Dunsandel for malting, and then it's been brought back. It's based on a recipe that was handed down by the descendants of the McRae family here, and it's basically Steve's preserve to we give him sort of free rein to look at local ingredients, traditional recipes, and really develop his own take on it. So the still itself is pretty much a work of art in its own right. It's was developed by Steve in association with some distillers in the North Island, and it was fabricated by a company in New Plymouth that built the Len Lye Centre, the big stainless steel art museum there. And it has a lot of components that have been developed by artists. We've got cast glass artist Phil Newbury, who's done a lot of the spirit receivers and various components of it. And it references an artist's impression of aspects of that local history. So it's not a traditional still. It's very much a kinetic sculpture. And art was a big part of this because we're very strongly connected with our local art gallery. I work with both of them. We've utilised artists to be part of the project and to assist us in telling the story, as we have worked with artists, with writers and musicians, as we did with the McRaes. What's interesting about the McRaes, whiskey was really important part of their culture, as was poetry, as was music. They brought the stills with them, they brought their pipes, and they brought their poetry books. And that was hugely important. So it wasn't just the development of a saleable spirit in isolation. It's all part of a big heritage and a big story, which involves not only distillers, but also artists and musicians and poets.
And I think that's, I believe I've seen a picture on the newly refurbished Hokonui Moonshine Museum website, which has just had a big blow up recently. But I think I've seen a picture of a big diorama that's been created of a policeman with the big cap with his ear to the door while there are some people inside. And I think I find it genuinely interesting. But I think there are people who will find it interesting that, yeah, these were people whose first language was not English, come over as a Gaelic-speaking population, and that's where the whiskey as a sign of rebellion was. Yeah, it's thumbing your nose at the excise tax, but it's because they would have called it Ushka Bear, the water of life. This is something that was it was an integral part of how you did life in season with growing your grain and farming and the poetry and the music and everything else. So it's fascinating to hear that, yeah, these are people who are doing their best to kind of transpose that Celtic way of life into Southland's hills, which, if you've been to the Highlands of Scotland and you've been around Southland, you can easily see those similarities there.
Yeah, I'm glad you picked that up, because it is part of it's a cultural thing rather than a product. It's just part of something that, we've had here for 150 years odd, and we hope that we're sort of adding to that story and adding to that culture and celebrating it the way that the McRaes did.
Well, I've just been nosing it this whole time, and it's sweet, and it's got a very light fruitiness about it. And yeah, I think it's worth mentioning, given that, yeah, we talk a lot about New Zealand spirits, but for whiskey in particular, when it runs off the still, it is clear. It would look a lot like this. And so a lot of the flavors you're getting from the barrel, people do put this clear spirit, inside of a barrel, and that interaction with the barrel is certainly going to generate, some would say improve, but it's certainly going to add to and enhance the flavor. And I think what the real skill is to create a spirit that is sippable on its own, that you are not then relying on a barrel to then try and cover up some of the rougher edges. And yeah, I'm going to take a sip now, but I think this is, while I am having a sip here, do you want to tell me a bit more about your work outside of the museum, and how the Moonshine Festival kind of fits into your broader remit?
Yes, well, the art gallery across the road, which I run, and also I work with the local historical museum, we sort of see ourselves as a three-legged stool in that regard, because we're celebrating culture in the broadest sense. Some of the lovely stories that have come out of the Hokonui story sort of weave in and out of our broader culture, and artists love the stories. And so when the opportunity arises, we will give aspects of those narratives to artists to explore, and also musicians. And there's obviously a very strong Celtic or Scottish component to it. But, the moonshine theme is hugely attractive to country artists.
Of which Gore is very much at the heart of
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And, without fail, people have a go at a Hokonui or a moonshine story if they possibly can. And once they visited here and we go through the narratives, they get quite excited about it. So from time to time, we will block the street off and we'll have an event, and we'll bring in musicians, but also bring in local food vendors. And we have a number of smaller events where we will have people that will explore the cuisine of the era, and probably more so the Prohibition era rather than the early McRae era, because during those Prohibition years, they encapsulated World War One, the Great Depression, World War Two. So when things were tight, people were quite adventurous with their cuisine, and it's sort of wild foods but with a twist. And again, grain plays an important role in that. What's grown locally, what's come out of our local river, what is come off our local pastures. And the McRaes, of course, are all farmers, and they're all farmers, and they were crop growers. So we kind of like to mix food and our spirit and music, and we work with poets a lot as well. They love the Hokonui story, and filmmakers from time to time. There are people who are scoping ideas there. It's one sort of big happy family, really, and that's how I think you keep those histories alive, because for each generation coming up through, they've got the ability to contribute to that story. So if we have distillers like Steve, but other visiting distillers who want to try something, then by all means, it's a history that's growing every day.
So when does the Moonshine Festival take place each year?
Generally, it's been every second year. Technically, it would have been this year, but we've been in building mode. Our street has been blocked off, and it's been a building site with the development of our new museum. It'll be 2027, which will be the next one. It's every 2 years. Alternate years, we have that huge Southern Field Days event, which is in Macrae country, just up the road. And that's a huge event where the whole community gets involved, and pretty much it sucks up every volunteer that in the district for that. So rather than compete with that, we have an alternate. So it'll be 2027. But we are having an event in May as part of the Tussock Country Music Festival, which includes the Gold Guitar Awards. So we are having a food and spirit event, and that's going to be in late May. And we'll have other small ones within the museum and within the precinct from time to time. Every 2 or 3 months, there'll be one. So just, watch social media. There'll be things happening.
Absolutely. It just sounds like such a vibrant place. And I hadn't, I knew of Golden Guitars, but I hadn't put the 2 and 2 together of this rich distilling history and country music, and of course they go together. You look to the US and everything going on there. That's very much those 2 interests walk very much hand in hand. That's funny. That is lovely. There's sweet. There's a little bit of pepperiness to it as well. But that's wonderful. That's it's definitely a grain spirit, grain forward. And people always say, what can you do with moonshine? This is certainly worth sipping on its own. But if we were to go back, I'm not sure if the McRae's may have been drinking it neat, but certainly coming forward to the time of the Major, is this a cocktail mixing type of spirit, or how are they drinking their
From
moonshine?
what we gather from Enright and from informants who knew him, his was more of a cocktail base. I think it was a spirit to augment. He was producing quite a lot. We were very fortunate to get to know his driver. Now, he had such a supply network that he had drivers that would service clients in mostly places that have been dry at some point. Anywhere the licensing trust has had localised prohibition for some form or another. Enright, because of his branding and labelling, he was sending a lot of spirit into places like Balclutha, but also Oamaru, Timu, Ashburton, those places. And during the war, he was really struggling to get drivers. A lot of blokes were away, overseas. He had no shortage of petrol coupons. There was no problem there, but drivers were a problem. And he engaged a chap called Everard Hill, who was 13 and a half years old. And Everard's mother was head of the Temperance Union in Invercargill. And because of his age, we got to know him before he passed away, and we interviewed him a couple of times. And he talked about running for the Major. So he would drive often from outside of Invercargill in a converted 32 Chev coupe, and full of demijohns of spirit, and he would deliver them at safe houses up and down State Highway 1. And there were safe houses where if something went wrong with the car, he knew he could take the car to, and nobody would look in the dicky seat or in the boot. And there were other safe houses where if he got into trouble, he could go to. And so we discovered a list of those, and he pretty much gave us the indication that the spirit of its own account was pretty rough. The drinker drank for the shock, not the flavour. So it really it required blending with something else. It was raw, and it was still fizzing at the bung. while he was driving it. He was a fascinating guy. It was a wonderful story, and again part of a story that we tell in the museum.
Yeah, growing up in and around Dunedin, and certainly from high school through into university, Hokonui Moonshine was just a byproduct of if something was particularly hot and rough, then you would, like, oh, that's like Hokonui Moonshine, talking about something, yeah, you're drinking for the shock as opposed for the flavor. And so I guess it's unfortunate that, because that's not what it would have started out like, but eventually, kind of, by the time you get to this, because Gore to Ashburton is a massive supply chain, and I guess when you're scaling up like that, you're going to be, if there's no regulatory oversight over your industry, you're going to cut some corners where you can.
Yeah. What was probably interesting with some of those operators, the connection to McRae's was very, very tenuous, if at all. Looking back over those 31 prosecutions for breach of the Distil-Nation Act, there was a McRae implicated in all but two. Often a very tenuous link to them. Enright was probably the one that didn't really have that connection, but he had great admiration for them, and hence the name Hokonui. And seeing an opportunity for a brand and having a bit of fun with it, which was good fun. But I think it's in some respects, you sort of go round in circles in terms of to a cultural product like this. There's various people who come on board and they contribute, and then you sort of go back to your roots, and then you sort of spring out again. And I hope, hopefully, in 150 years' time, people still be producing it, and it will have, a connection, but it might sort of go off on its own tangent somewhere, and that's fine. That's good.
Yeah. Before we head into the future, I want to go back to Everard, the driver. Is this car that he's driving, has it been converted in some way so that, because I'm assuming that there would have been checkpoints on the road, so that as he's going from district to district, people would have been looking out for illicit booze being smuggled into dry counties. So would he have altered this car so that there's stuff hidden in different crevices or in seats or something along those lines?
I believe so. From what we gathered from Ev, there was certainly strength and springs in the back. The dicky seat was converted into so it could hold multiple demijohns of spirit. But I think he was sort of he looked older than 13, but he was clearly a young chap who was driving a nice car, which was clearly not his. And I think they probably just left him alone. He didn't look suspicious at all. He was not that kind of person. Some of the safe houses were sort of good God-fearing homes who kept an eye on him and looked after him and just managed things. So he ended up with a car, seemingly, at the end of by the time he was 15 and a half. There were some other chaps who'd come back from war, and they'd taken on that role on his behalf. So he was allowed to keep the car.
Good on him.
Extraordinary.
How we didn't address it before. How big's a demijohn? What are we talking about there?
Oh, I think it's those big crocks that you see often in second-hand shops, and some of them have sort of got weaving across them. I don't know how many gallons would be in it. Fair amount, sort of those
like a ceramic type of jug.
Ceramic, yeah.
Oh, interesting. It's okay. If we maybe talk a wee bit about the future, and then I brought up the the horse going off to find that still, but I would love to hear one or two more of these cat and mouse games, because I think too often when we people talk prohibition, and they talk, evading the police and altered cars and all these kinds of things. You think of America, but there's actually so much of this happening in New Zealand that I think would genuinely surprise people. But before we take that trip into the past, there, you've mentioned the future. What does the future look like? Does it involve you putting some of the spirit into a barrel for real and making whiskey, or what does the future look like for the museum and preserving these stories?
We're developing some standard lines of spirit at the moment. We've got 3 of them, which sell really well. So we're just getting that momentum going. We're looking at working with some other local growers who are going to be supplying us with. We want to have everything as local as possible. We're looking at an oat-based spirit. Our distiller Steve has been working quietly on that. We're doing some test runs of that. Barrel aging down the track, yes. At the moment, we're just focusing our momentum on servicing the requirements of our current customer base, and it's quite big. We're finding we're getting a lot of tours coming through the museum, a lot of internationals coming through. They love the story. They obviously can't buy the big bottles, but they can buy the 100 mils because they're allowed to take that on the plane with them. So we find that's quite an amazing we're getting a really good run of sales with those. So we're just doing it quietly at the moment. We're just refining what we've got and making sure we've got plenty of stock, because at the moment we're the only point of sale. We're not putting it out anywhere else, and we want to make sure that there's something very special that can only be acquired from these premises, and giving Steve the opportunity to sort of experiment. There's been recipes that have come forward. We're just looking at and looking at the history surrounding some of them. And of course, when you go back to Mary McRae, she was a healer. She understood flora and its medicinal properties, and so she would have utilised elements of that in her spirit. So it's just a work in progress. Interestingly, you mentioned other stories that relate to it. They tend to come out of the local brewery, and there's one really good example of that. Probably the biggest operation ever shut down here was in 1933, and it was a bloke called Jim Quirk who had quite a substantial still, and he was in the Tussock country, just over the hill from Gore here in a place called Ferndale. And a lot of people knew that he was making spirit, and he was making a lot of it, and he was selling a lot of it. And word got around that what he was doing, but police and customs, I think they may have visited his property, but not obviously gone into the outbuildings and the sheds and never thinking that he was operating out amongst the tussock. But he was acquiring a lot of malt from the local brewery. And we just received an oral history that arrived from a family and just a matter of a few months ago, where an old lady passed away and she handed over some documents to her family. And this was a reminiscence. Her family were neighbours of this particular distiller. He got to the point where he didn't like going into Gore, into the brewery and picking up bags of malt, because it was, he was obviously, the opportunity was there for police to, acknowledge that he was at the brewery and shouldn't have been. So in order to undertake a fairly substantial spirit run, he organised quite a load of bags to be sent by train to the Mataura railway station. And this was in 1933. So it was quite a load that was going to be deposited at the Mataura railway station. He would quietly go in and pick it up, take it in his truck and take it to the farm. So there's just one trip, and that would last him for a long time. Word obviously got out that this load of malt was going to Mataura, so obviously it was going to a still. The railways people were instructed where to place all these bags of malt on the platform, and a constable and a customs officer would be there, but they would keep themselves hidden. The malt would be deposited. They would hide until the person who owned the malt came to pick it up with their truck, and then they would either pounce or they would follow him to the farm and activate.
Because at this point, picking up malt, yes, it's a suspiciously large quantity, but he hasn't actually broken the law at this point, right?
Not at this point, no, he hasn't. Yeah. But they were suspecting that either they would apprehend him or detain him and question him, or else they would follow him. So the malt arrives at the railway station. Nothing happens, and then suddenly a fight breaks out across the street. And there's this shouting and swearing, all this thing happening. So the police and the customs guy go across the street to sort of sort the police and officer to sort all this out. And they do eventually, and they come back, and of course it's all gone.
Yeah, I could see that coming a mile away.
But he was caught. He was caught with 160 gallons of wash on site. In 1933, and in December 1933, he was taken to court and fined £500. Now, if you look at the car dealer across the road here in 1933, a brand new 4-door Dodge sedan was 250 quid. So that puts that fine into context. It's also important to note that he did pay the fine. And that was in 1933 at the tail end of the Depression. So clearly there was a cash flow that was being generated by that activity, quite a considerable one. So there were people who were in it for to support their farms, support their businesses, others for the fun of it, others as a cultural activity that they'd done for generations. So there's quite a mix of Hokonui within that framework.
Yeah, it's so fascinating, and because I how much of, I personally believe that a direct line can be drawn with some of the major binge drinking issues and attitudes that the government is doing its best to try and stamp out, and alcohol harm and all of that. And you can tie that a direct line to the 6 o'clock swill, which, okay, and this was the government deciding, okay, we don't quite have the mandate to introduce temperance and prohibition over the whole country, but there is an appetite for change in alcohol laws. And so if we reduce the amount of time which the licensed premises are open, then we can then curb the amount that people are drinking. And you can tie this direct line from there to here, and so many people have, and you see it today, that there are parts of West Auckland and Invercargill and other parts of New Zealand that are still operating under licensing trusts. There is this conservative attitude towards alcohol in general, which kind of fails to see the nuance that when you go back to the origin of when it came over and how it got established and spread out, that there is quite a lot of nuance in the beginning of why people were doing it and how they were doing it and their motivations for being producers and consumers.
Yeah. Hey, Cameron, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to, I've got another engagement at 2:30.
All right.
Sorry about that.
No. This has been an incredibly enlightening conversation. Thank you, Jim, so much. If people want to find out more about the Hokonui Moonshine Museum, where can they go to?
Really good question. If you Google us, we have a website. It's being developed as we speak, so it's being added to. So I think just Hokonui, Old Hokonui or Hokonui Moonshine. We're easy to find. Unlike your predecessors.
You don't have to go snooping into the hills to try and find the illicit still today. No, that is perfect. Thank you, Jim, so much for your time. And make sure you subscribe so that you can hear more stories about New Zealand spirits. My name's Cameron. This has been the Distil-Nation NZ podcast. Thank you for listening.